Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that the wedding of Derek and Ashley might be delayed because his father is moving into Fairmont Crest. That small sentence unspooled into 1,000 fissures into whispered phone calls and wrapped boxes and a calendar whose red-circled date grew faint as worry set in. At first it sounded like an if-then, if Baldwin Sr. comes, if he stays, then plans must shift. But rumors live the way seeds do in small towns. They take root and grow into trees whose shade no one anticipated. In Fairmont Crest, where streets remember names and the past is very nearly a neighbor, the possibility that Derek's father would move back into town was less a logistical hiccup and more a tectonic shift. It pulled at threads that had been quietly knotted for years. Derek carried his secret like an unfinished sentence. He had rehearsed it enough to know how to start casual, deflective, a joke tossed at the right time, but he had never found a place to finish it. The secret was precise, heavy and peculiar, the kind of thing that reshapes a life if it is finally voiced. He worked on memory, on a mission, on the economy of silence. He smiled at Ashley the way men do who keep rooms of their life walled off. He kissed her in the kitchen, in empty corridors, in the kind of benediction that hoped for absolution without confession. The secret wasn't cinematic, it had no grand reveal, but it was cumulative, made of small betrayals, bad choices and a single late night that had left him with fingerprints on someone else's life. When Shanice and Jacob nudged him, it was because they could see the way changing his gait. They smelled it like bad ink on an otherwise clean letter. Shanice, blunt, sarcastic, and not indulgent, had the kind of friendship that doesn't permit theatrical denials. She told Derek what he already suspected: secrets demand to be finished or they will finish you. Her reminders were practical rather than moralizing. Call the lawyer, sign the papers, tell Ashley the truth before someone else does. Jacob, quieter and stubborn in his optimism, approached Derek with a different tone. He imagined a tidy confession leading to repair, to a humbling that made room for honesty. He lacked Shanice's cynicism, and so his reminders were gentle, almost hopeful. These two voices became the metronome of Derek's days, each tick a request for resolution. He kept deflecting and the tick grew louder. Ashley reacted with the kind of grace that reads like courage because it's actually fatigue. She had still loved Derek long enough to have learned that affection is not the same as idealization. She had been the nurse who patched up his literal wounds and the woman who had, more importantly, humanized him after all the small cruelties that life had taught him. That she could step back after their breakup and still say, with a steady hand, that Derek's father moving near was reasonable, said less about complacency than about a practical tenderness. She knew the reasons families drift apart and the reasons they circle back. For Ashley, proximity didn't make a man guiltless, it made him reachable. She could imagine the old man's arrival, a formal shifting into town, boxes stacked, the awkward introductions to neighbors who remember too much. That image cut both ways: relief that Derek was not alone, and apprehension about what that proximity would stir. Baldwin Sr. arrived with the meticulousness of someone who never learned to be casual. He was not theatrical in his entry. He sold himself to the town like a compact, careful roomer, the sort of man who dresses in weatherproof logic and whose voice does not betray the soft shocks of his history. At first everyone assumed he would attend the wedding, attend politely and then return to whatever quiet life he preferred. Instead he put down roots. Saying he decided to stay was an understatement. He declared presence, like someone who took the calendar in his hands and redrew it. The town, which watched comings and goings like weather, noticed immediately. People who had once perceived him only through the tint of Derek's memories now had to meet him face to face. And what they met was not the quiet, repentant elder some had imagined. They met a man with a sharpness that suggested unfinished business. That sharpness mattered because Fairmont Crest's law enforcement had creased into a familiar complicity. Honest officers were rare, the tilt toward convenient enforcement had become institutional. Marcel, the locally respected cop, had learned to make room for compromise. He was the sort of officer who balanced the ledger by choosing battles, and he chose those battles with the prudence of someone with a mortgage. Joey, by contrast, had long ago blurred the line between protector and predator. He was the architecture of corruption in town, confident, embedded, unashamed, a man whose authority had been built on the willingness of others to look away. His influence shaped Marcel's decisions not only because Joey was louder but because he was dangerous. Joey's threats were reputations more than actions. Rumors sharpened into consequences. Baldwin Sr.'s presence suggested a replacement for that state of affairs. It hinted at the possibility of a man whose moral compass spun true. He might be the steadying influence the town needed. The kind of elder who insisted on standards that had become aspirational in Fairmont Crest. But there was another, darker possibility. He could be a threat to Joey, an adversary armed with both principle and the willingness to follow it. In some ways the town held its breath. If Baldwin Sr. arrived as a kind of mission, a quest to revive accountability, then Joey's checkered empire would be under a threat that could not be smoothed away by the usual payments and promises. Rumors of Baldwin Sr.'s intentions migrated through the town in the unnatural way secrets do, variably, vividly, and often with striking embellishments. Some said he had came to confront Joey directly, others whispered of a past that bound him to the police force in ways not yet disclosed. Those who knew Jacob saw a different narrative shape up. Jacob, newly determined in his own integrity, might finally have the partner his character always asked for. Jacob had been the steady hand in recent months, the one who always asked the question no one else wanted to hear. He had grown into a certain honesty that made people uncomfortable because it refused to be neutral. For him, Baldwin Sr. was not just another neighbor, he was a mirror. The two of them, stoic and immovable, began to form a tandem vision of what law could be, the kind that did not depend on silence as lubricant. It is significant to note that Greg Vaughan's character did not arrive as the predictable archetype of a kindly patriarch. He came instead with an energy that suggested history, the worn notches of someone versed in human frailty but also persistent in the belief that systems can be reset. He watched the town's rhythms and made mental notes. He sat in the diner and listened to fragments. Mostly, he was quiet until something, a detail, a face, made him speak with the clarity of someone who had long been inside the machinery of justice and thought he might have one more chance to repair it. Doug's death was the fulcrum. It had been sudden, ugly in its consequences, and cleanly wrapped enough to be called an accident by those willing to call it that. But no great or small town remains untroubled when death arrives with questions. Doug had been the kind of presence that is easily underestimated, unassuming, someone who kept late hours and loved a quiet beer at the bar. His death was initially filed away as random, tragic. The coroner's report, the paramedics' notes, a cheap casket, all of these elements conspired to present closure. But some things resist tidy endings. People who knew Doug spoke of last conversations that didn't make sense. A neighbor saw a car slow more than it should have the night before. A text message unearthed by a friend hinted at an argument about money. When a man like Baldwin Sr. moves into town and then hears those details, he does not let them rest in someone else's file. Derek felt the gravity of Doug's absence differently because his secret and Doug's death were stitched in ways he could not afford to explain. You do not live in a small town long without seeing how threads cross. Someone's decision to move a fence, a line in a police report left intentionally vague, a neighbor's inclination to close the blinds. The closer he got to Baldwin Sr.'s orbit, the more Derek felt the uncanny sensation that choices he had thought private were becoming visible in a new light. He began to rehearse conversations with Ashley that never reached their clean conclusion. In private, he held the objects of his own guilt and weighed their edges, the text that was never sent, the envelope kept in a sock drawer, the unusual phone call cut short. Joey's life had been a ledger of small triumphs. He was a man who had mastered the art of moral leakage, how to let virtue flow out in ways that appeared accidental but served his interests precisely. He had undermined rivals through gossip, leaned on families with threats, and used the law as both cloak and club. The neatness of Doug's death murdered some of his quiet confidence. When Baldwin Sr. arrived and raised a hand to sift through past mistakes, Joey's shadows deepened. He slept poorly, he replayed phone calls and wondered which ones had been recorded and which people had so data enough to keep evidence out of fear. There was a particular fear in him, that a man with Baldwin's temperament would not only look at the obvious traces but would start to map the omissions, the places where a ledger did not close. Marcel, tangled in loyalty and fear, found himself moving through the town like a man who had to keep multiple doors open. He paid his dues to authority while trying to protect his family and his position. Joey's power over him had been practical, a threat that could remove a job, harm a reputation, make life small. So when Baldwin Sr. suggested, politely and with the air of someone used to being obeyed, that perhaps the town required clearer rules, Marcel registered the suggestion as both a solution and a threat. Would he defy Joey? Could he become the kind of officer Baldwin Sr. hoped to cultivate? These questions hollowed him. He began to watch Jacob differently, not with jealousy, but with a tentative hope and the rueful recognition of a man who had not been entirely proud of his compromises. There was a strange choreography to the small town's politics. People stood on porches and watched, not because they were idle but because the act of watching was a way to participate without owning the consequences. For Derek and Ashley, the choreography was internal. They kept their shared spaces tidy and their conversations sparse. Ashley, in the sterile light of the hospital where she worked, saw suffering as data, symptoms, causes, interventions. That training changed her approach to Derek's evasiveness. She assessed him clinically, counting the ways he avoided eye contact and cataloging mundane inconsistencies. Where a lover might see mystery and romance, a nurse sees pattern and consequence. She began to anticipate the secret's likely shape and found that, while knowledge would complicate affection, it would not erase it. That is perhaps what frightened Derek most, the possibility that what he feared would change Ashley's face. Not by removing love but by making him visible in the way he had tried so long to avoid. Jacob, who had always preferred action over speculation, began to interview the town's edges. He went to barbers and bakeries and the lamplit stoops where old men and women sat and told stories that were part memory and part entertainment. He listened for asymmetries, the places where someone laughed too long at a joke, or where someone's eyes slid away from a question. He found a few crumbs: a man who said Doug had been anxious about something, a woman who had heard a late-night argument, a mechanic who remembered fixing a car at an unusual hour. Each detail was small, but Jacob was patient. He knew, with the deep calm of someone who believes in cause and effect, that small details become a map when given enough attention. He started to record everything, a habit that made him feel both intense and strangely sane. Derek's father, meanwhile, made overtures that were deliberate rather than sentimental. He did not try to charm or apologize at first. Instead he assessed, built, and maneuvered. He was good at reading the fine print of human beings, at identifying what they prized and what they feared. He listened to town histories like a general preparing a campaign. When he asked Derek about his plans for the wedding, he did so with a mix of curiosity and calculation. What would change if he stayed? Derek answered vaguely, and Baldwin Sr.'s eyes narrowed. He was an expert at waiting for shapes to emerge and then naming them at the right moment. He subscribed to the theory that once a secret is named, it loses half of its power. A funeral made the town gather with the kind of moods funerals always do: sorrow seasoned by accusation, stories seasoned by hindsight. Doug's casket sat modestly in the center of a community that insisted on closure because closure keeps conscience manageable. People spoke about Doug with the warmth of remembrance and the sharpness of interrogation. Some uttered the kind of platitudes that are rituals. Others, like Jacob, listened for strain in their words. In those strains, meaning thrummed. Baldwin Sr. attended the funeral with the attention of an outsider who had become an insider overnight. He watched the faces as if he were reading a lineup, and when he passed a note to Jacob, an innocuous gesture that implied confidence, the two men formed a quiet partnership. That partnership, newly formed, set the rest of the town into a state of watchful anxiety. Doug's death did not become an abstract case file. It became a mirror in which the town saw parts of itself. For Joey, the mirror shattered into 1,000 possibilities. He began to suspect not only that his actions would be discovered, but that the disclosure might come from places he had always considered harmless: a bartender, a neighbor nervous enough to talk, a son who had been trying to hold a secret and had cracked. He changed his movements: shorter routes, fewer social gatherings, calls monitored by his thumb. His fear was precise. He imagined the net closing like an animal. The more Baldwin Sr. and Jacob suspected, the smaller Joey's world became. Derek's secret pulsed at the edges of every confrontation. When Ashley asked about Baldwin Sr.'s motives, Derek fumbled. He had trained himself the way sailors learn to write a list, tiny corrections, barely visible, until a sudden wave made all adjustments ineffective. He considered telling Ashley something partial, an oblique confession that would ease his conscience but preserve dignity. Yet the more he considered any partial truth, the more he understood that half-truths were sometimes worse than the deepest silences. He found himself studying the shape of admissions in other people's stories, the way apologies can become weapons, how partial stories create new obligations. He feared that any confession might be a detonator. At night, Fairmont Crest assumed the shape of thinking. Streets cooled, lights were extinguished, and people lay awake weighing the small moral equations of their lives. Derek walked them, submitting himself to the arithmetic of guilt. He thought about Doug, about the way someone's life could fold into the life of another without either person noticing until it was too late. He considered Joey, the ways that the police force had been used as a tool for accumulation and silence, and he considered his father, who had arrived with an intention that might fracture the settled arrangements. Derek pictured Ashley, asleep beside him, cheeks relaxed, and he felt the future as something that might be altered irrevocably by the speech he refused to speak. As tensions rose, alliances formed and frayed. Marcel began to test his loyalties in quieter ways, a report filed promptly here, an interrogation carried out with an unusual firmness there. He felt the tug between self-preservation and the growing sense that a town could not sustain itself on silent pacts. Meanwhile, Joey increased his surveillance. More patrols when it mattered, calls to certain people that were cold and sharp. He sought to recreate the equilibrium that had made him comfortable. But the equilibrium was fragile, more of a varnish than a foundation. Baldwin Sr.'s arrival suggested that what had been varnish might yet be scraped away. There was a single moment as small as a key sliding into a lock when everything felt as if it might tip. Derek received a call in the late afternoon from a number he didn't immediately recognize. He answered, and the voice on the line was clipped and formal. It did not ask much. It asked only whether he would come down to the police station for a brief talk about Doug. Derek felt the secret pulley within him move. He thought of Ashley's face, of her trust, of the wedding that might be postponed by a father's arrival and the consequences this father might unleash. He looked out the window at Fairmont Crest's sloping lawns, at Baldwin Sr.'s house where the lawn had been raked with a precise, deliberate hand. The call had no tone of urgency, only a civility that is sometimes the precursor to consequences. To his friends it would have looked like a necessary appointment, to Derek it looked like a hinge. He hesitated, as if the hesitation could rewrite the past. Then he told himself that he would go. He told himself that perhaps, finally, he could finish the sentence he had been carrying for months. He did not know whether finishing a secret would save him or condemn him, but he knew that silence had already taken too much. The town watched, as towns do, but it watched now with the new focus of a crowd on the brink of witnessing something decisive. The rest of the day moved in small, weighted motions, the tapping of keys, the clink of cups, the way light fell differently over the cemetery where Doug's fresh mound still glossed the grass. Derek dressed and left, a man who carried a private storm like a coat. At the station, Baldwin Sr. stood by a window, his profile cut against the afternoon. Jacob was there, and Marcel too, awkward in his own unease. Joey did not enter the room. His presence was instead suggested in the empty chair, in the way the conversation shifted when certain names were mentioned. Baldwin Sr. greeted Derek with a nod that felt like an invitation to terms neither had yet formulated. He spoke in ways that left no room for rhetoric, short sentences that suggested a man who preferred to arrange facts rather than argue feelings. Derek's heart began to hammer. He felt both shame and a strange relief. The secret that had held him like a tremor was about to be examined. What followed in that room would change the town's measured rhythm. Words were measured out like stakes, quietly and deliberately. Questions were asked that Derek had been avoiding for months. He tried to answer with the control of someone who has practiced evasions, but evasions do not withstand the concentrated light of a small constellation of grave, observant people. The conversation folded into the kinds of admissions that are more like maps than absolution, lines drawn connecting actions to outcomes, each line rendering certain futures less possible and others suddenly imminent. And as those lines were traced, as gravity shifted toward the center of Doug's death and the web that had secretly bound Joey and others began to take form, Derek felt the world compress. He thought of Ashley, of Shanice, of Jacob, and of his father, all of them now elements in a drama that was refusing to be neat. He left the station with more than he had brought, not because he was liberated, but because the contours of the problem were now visible. The secret, once named and partially revealed, had altered the equation. It did not resolve things, instead it prepared the ground for consequences that would not be tidy. On the steps outside, the late sunlight cut the street into bright and shadow, and Derek found himself at a threshold he could no longer circumnavigate. He called Ashley and watched her name fill his screen. He wanted to be honest. He wanted to be forgiven. The words lodged in his throat like an accusation. Inside the town, people returned to their routines but with eyes that would not forget. The wedding date still hovered on a calendar, but its meaning had shifted. It was now a conditional, a mark that required a certain reckoning before it could be celebrated. And yet, even as things formed into new alignments and loyalties reshuffled their cards, no one had the whole picture. Secrets still nested inside secrets. Loyalties hung by thin threads. Joey, unaware of the full scale of what was racing toward him, continued to move like a man who believed himself untouchable. Baldwin Sr. and Jacob had formed a fragile, moral tandem. Marcel's allegiance trembled between past comforts and a future that demanded clearer choices. Doug's death, the loudest silence in the town, sat like a thermometer for the moral temperature of Fairmont Crest. Derek walked home in a mood that was equal parts dread and clarity, certain only of one thing: when the truth opened its mouth, the town would hear it, and whatever sound it made would change everything.